The wrench slipped from my oil-stained fingers and clattered against the concrete floor of Riley's auto repair. I'd been under the hood of Mrs. Henderson's ancient Buick for the better part of an hour, trying to coax life back into an engine that should have been retired during the Clinton administration. But in Millbrook, Tennessee, population 3,847, we made do with what we had. "Damn carburetor," I muttered, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand. The July heat was suffocating even with the garage doors wide open, and my coveralls stuck to my skin like a second, uncomfortable layer. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Riley Chen, and for the past 4 years, I've been the grease monkey who keeps this sleepy town's vehicles running. Not exactly the career path my parents had in mind when they immigrated from Taiwan with dreams of their daughter becoming a doctor or lawyer. But life has a way of taking unexpected turns, especially when you're trying to disappear from your old one. "Riley," came a voice from the front office. "You got a customer." I grabbed a shop rag and headed toward the front, my steel-toed boots echoing in the empty bay. Millbrook wasn't exactly bustling with automotive emergencies. Most days, I was lucky to see 3 customers, and 2 of them were usually just stopping by to complain about their neighbor's dog or discuss the weather. The customer waiting for me was Tommy Patterson, a lanky 18-year-old who'd graduated high school 2 months ago and spent most of his time hanging around the local Dairy Queen, hitting on girls who were way out of his league. "Hey, Miss Chen," he said, that crooked grin of his already apologetic. "My mom's Honda is making this weird noise. Like, really weird." I followed him outside to where a 2003 Civic sat idling roughly in my parking lot. The sound it was making could generously be described as mechanical death rattles. "When did it start?" I asked, popping the hood. "About 10 minutes ago. I was driving past the old Carlisle farm, and it just started doing that." I nodded, already diagnosing the problem by sound alone. "Timing belt, probably. It would cost more to fix than the car was worth, but I'd find a way to make it work for the Pattersons." "That's what you did in small towns, you took care of each other." "Leave it with me," I said. "I'll call you later with an estimate." Tommy handed me his keys with visible relief. "Thanks, Miss Chen. You're a lifesaver." If only he knew how literally I'd earned that description. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As his friend picked him up, I wheeled the Honda into the garage and got back to work. This was my routine: fix cars, avoid personal questions, keep my head down, and try not to think about the life I'd left behind. It had worked for 4 years. It should have worked forever, but nothing stays buried forever, especially not in the age of satellite surveillance and digital footprints that stretch back decades. The first sign that my carefully constructed new life was about to implode came at 2:47 p.m., when I was elbow-deep in the Civic's engine compartment. The sound started as a distant thrumming, barely audible over the radio playing classic rock in the corner. But my ears were trained to recognize that particular rhythmic beat, trained by years of listening for it in places where it meant the difference between rescue and death. Helicopters. Multiple helicopters. And they were getting closer. I straightened up slowly, my hands instinctively wiping themselves clean on my coveralls. In Millbrook, the most exciting aircraft we ever saw were the occasional crop dusters. The thrumming grew louder, more distinct, and I felt my chest tighten with a familiar mixture of adrenaline and dread. Through the open garage door, I could see people emerging from the diner across the street, shading their eyes and looking skyward. Mrs. Patterson from the flower shop stood on her front step, her hand pressed to her chest as if the sound might be some kind of emergency, but I knew better. I knew exactly what kind of helicopters made that sound, flew in that formation, approached with that particular tactical precision. I'd ridden in them, jumped out of them, called for them when everything had gone sideways in places whose names I couldn't pronounce. The Black Hawks. At least 3 of them, maybe 4. And they were heading straight for my garage. I backed deeper into the shop, my mind racing through possibilities. Coincidence was my first hope, maybe they were just passing through, heading to some training exercise at Fort Campbell, 2 hours south. Maybe they needed fuel, or had a mechanical issue, or were responding to some emergency I hadn't heard about on the local news. but as the sound grew thunderous overhead and I saw the first sleek, military green silhouette pass over my building, I knew I was lying to myself. For years of hiding, for years of anonymous small-town life, and somehow they'd found me. The helicopters circled once, a tactical maneuver I recognized as a reconnaissance pass, before setting down in the empty field directly behind my garage. The rotor wash sent dust and debris swirling through my open doors, and I had to grab a tarp to keep it from covering Mrs. Henderson's Buick entirely. For a moment after the engines wound down, everything was silent except for the settling tick of cooling metal and the distant excited voices of townspeople gathering in the street to gawk. I could imagine their conversations. What in the Sam Hill are military helicopters doing in Millbrook? Do you think it's some kind of emergency? Maybe they're looking for terrorists or something. If only they knew how right and wrong they were. I heard boots on gravel. Multiple sets, moving with the practiced coordination of soldiers who'd worked together for years. They were approaching the rear entrance of my garage, the door I kept locked and used only for deliveries. My hands were steady as I reached for the tool cabinet where I kept my emergency bag, the one I'd hoped never to need again. Inside were documents, cash, a burner phone, and a .45 caliber Glock that I'd prayed would remain unfired for the rest of my life. But my hand stopped short of opening the cabinet. Running would only confirm what they already suspected. And after 4 years of building a life here, of becoming part of this community, I wasn't sure I wanted to disappear again. Not without knowing why they'd come. The knock on the rear door was firm but polite. Professional. Ms. Chen? This is Colonel Sarah Martinez, United States Army Special Operations. We need to speak with you. I recognized the voice immediately, though it had been 4 years since I'd heard it. Colonel Martinez had been my commanding officer during my last deployment, the woman who'd signed my discharge papers and told me I was free to disappear into civilian life with no questions asked. Apparently, that promise had an expiration date. I walked to the door slowly, giving myself time to think. Through the frosted glass, I could see the silhouettes of at least 6 people. Too many for a friendly chat, not enough for an arrest. This was something else entirely. I unlocked the door and opened it to find Colonel Martinez looking exactly as I remembered, steel gray hair pulled back severely, dark eyes that missed nothing, and the kind of posture that screamed military authority even in civilian clothes. Behind her stood 5 soldiers in full combat gear, their weapons lowered but ready. "Hello, Chen," she said, using my old call sign. "We need to talk." I stepped aside to let them in, noting how they automatically spread out to cover the exits and clear sight lines. Old habits die hard, and these people had the same training I'd had. "Colonel," I acknowledged. "It's been a while." "Not nearly long enough, I'm afraid." She looked around my garage, taking in the ordinary tools, the civilian cars, the classic rock still playing softly on the radio. "You've built a nice life here. I had your word that I could." "You did. And under normal circumstances, that word would still be good." She moved closer, her voice dropping to the tone I remembered from mission briefings. "But circumstances haven't been normal for the past 6 months." I waited, knowing she'd get to the point eventually. Colonel Martinez had never been one for small talk or social niceties. "We have a situation," she continued. "One that requires your particular skill set. I'm retired." "No one retires from what you did, Chen. You know that. You just go inactive until your country needs you again." The familiar weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. 4 years ago, I'd walked away from a world of classified missions, split-second life-or-death decisions, and operations that never appeared in any official record. I'd traded it for oil changes, brake jobs, and customers who complained about repair costs. I'd thought I was done saving the world. "What's the situation?" I asked, already knowing I wouldn't like the answer. Colonel Martinez nodded to one of her soldiers, who stepped forward with a tablet. The screen showed satellite imagery of a compound I didn't recognize, somewhere in what looked like Eastern Europe based on the terrain. 3 days ago, a joint CIA-NSA listening post in Moldova went dark, she explained. 14 operatives, including some of our best intelligence assets in the region. No distress call, no indication of trouble. They just vanished. I studied the imagery, noting the tactical advantages and vulnerabilities of the compounds. Position. It was isolated, easily defensible, but also easily cut off. Equipment failure? Natural disaster? Negative. Satellite shows the compound is intact, but there's been significant activity in the area. Unmarked vehicles, personnel movement patterns consistent with a hostile takeover. So send in a rescue team. We tried. Alpha team went in 48 hours ago. We lost contact 6 hours after insertion. That got my attention. Alpha team was comprised of the best special operations soldiers in the world. If they'd gone dark, this wasn't a simple hostage situation or equipment malfunction. How many? I asked. 8 operators. All with level 5 clearance and extensive field experience. So now they had 22 American operatives in hostile hands, assuming any of them were still alive. The geopolitical implications alone were staggering, never mind the human cost. I still don't understand why you need me specifically, I said, though I was beginning to suspect the answer. Colonel Martinez swiped to the next image on the tablet. It showed a grainy photograph of a man in tactical gear, his face partially obscured by night vision equipment. But I recognized the build, the stance, the way he held his weapon. My blood went cold. Because, the colonel said quietly, preliminary. Intelligence suggests the operation is being run by Viktor Kozlov. Viktor Kozlov. The ghost I'd spent 3 years hunting across half a dozen countries. The arms dealer, human trafficker, and general merchant of misery who'd slipped through my fingers more times than I cared to count. The man whose operation I'd finally dismantled in Belarus, costing him approximately $200 million and most of his network, the man who'd put a bounty on my head that was probably still active. He's supposed to be dead, I said. So, are you, officially speaking? Yet here we are. I handed the tablet back, my mind already shifting into operational mode despite my best efforts to remain detached. Even if Kozlov is alive, even if he's behind this, I'm not the only operator who's tangled with him. Why come to me? Colonel Martinez exchanged glances with her team before answering. Because according to our intelligence, he specifically requested you. The words hit me like a physical blow. What do you mean, requested me? The listening post received one transmission before going dark. Just 5 words, tell Chen I'm waiting. The garage suddenly felt too small, too warm, too exposed. 4 years of hiding, for years of building a normal life, and somehow Viktor Kozlov had found me in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee. Worse, he'd used American operatives as bait to draw me out. This is personal for him, I realized. Appears that way. Which makes you either our biggest asset or our greatest liability. I walked to the front of the garage, looking out at the street where half the town had gathered to gawk at the military presence. Mrs. Henderson stood next to her ancient Buick, probably wondering why armed soldiers were talking to her mechanic. Tommy Patterson was there too, his mouth hanging open as he tried to process what he was seeing. These people had become my community, my responsibility. I'd fix their cars, listen to their problems, become part of the fabric of their small town lives. They didn't deserve to be collateral damage in a war they didn't even know existed, but 22 American operatives were counting on someone to come for them, and Viktor Kozlov had made it clear that someone was me. What's the timeline? I asked, turning back to face Colonel Martinez. Wheels up in 6 hours. Briefing en route. And if I refuse? Then good people die, and you spend the rest of your life knowing you could have prevented it. She was right, of course. That was the curse of having the skills I had. Once you'd proven you could make a difference, walking away became almost impossible. Even when walking away was the smart thing to do. I looked around my garage one more time, at the life I'd built from nothing. The Honda still needed its timing belt replaced. Mrs. Henderson was expecting her Buick tomorrow. Tommy Patterson would probably spread the story of military helicopters at the garage for the next 50 years, all of it would have to wait. I'll need to make arrangements, I said. Find someone to cover the shop while I'm gone. Already handled. Army Corps of Engineers is sending a mechanic to keep your business running. Cover story is that you're attending a specialized training course. Of course, they'd already thought of everything. That's what made them good at their jobs and dangerous. To cross. One condition, I said. You're not really in a position to negotiate, Chen. One condition, I repeated firmly. This town, these people, they stay out of it. Whatever happens, however this goes down, Millbrook remains off limits. Colonel Martinez studied me for a moment, perhaps recognizing something of the soldier. I used to be beneath the grease-stained coveralls and civilian facade. Agreed, she said finally. But Chen? Yes. You should know that Kozlov isn't working alone. We have reason to believe he's backed by someone with significant resources and government connections. Meaning? Meaning this might be bigger than a personal vendetta. A lot bigger. The implications of that statement would have to wait. Right now, I had 6 hours to transform myself from Riley Chen, small-town mechanic, back into the operator I used to be. 6 hours to dig up equipment I'd hoped never to touch again, to resurrect skills I'd tried to forget, to become the weapon my country needed. As Colonel Martinez and her team filed out of my garage, heading back to their helicopters, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the chrome bumper of Mrs. Henderson's Buick. For just a moment, I saw not the woman who'd spent 4 years hiding from her past, but the soldier who'd once been considered one of the most dangerous people alive. Victor Kozlov wanted to play games with American lives? Fine, but he'd forgotten one crucial detail about the woman he'd been hunting all these years. I'd never lost a mission once I accepted it, and I wasn't planning to start now. The C-130 transport plane vibrated like a washing machine with a broken drum, and I gripped the webbed seating as we hit another pocket of turbulence somewhere over the Atlantic. Around me, 6 of America's finest special operations soldiers checked their gear with the methodical precision that comes from years of doing the same thing before walking into hell. I'd traded my coveralls for tactical black, my tool belt for a weapons harness that felt both foreign and familiar after 4 years. The muscle memory was still there: how to check my sidearm, how to position my knife for quick access, how to breathe through the pre-mission adrenaline that made my hands want to shake. 15 minutes to drop zone, announced Captain Jake Morrison, the team leader who looked barely old enough to buy a beer, let alone lead a rescue operation into hostile territory. But his eyes held the kind of steady confidence that made me trust him despite his apparent youth. The mission brief had been thorough and terrifying. The Moldova compound wasn't just a listening post, it was a black site facility conducting surveillance on Russian military movements near the Ukrainian border. The 14 operatives inside had been monitoring communications, tracking weapons shipments, and providing intelligence that had prevented 3 separate international incidents in the past year. Now they were gone, along with 8 of our best soldiers who'd tried to rescue them, and Victor Kozlov was waiting for me in the middle of it all. Chen, Morrison said, settling into the seat across from me. I need to ask, what's your history with this Kozlov character? Command was pretty tight-lipped about the details. I stared out the small porthole at the darkness below, trying to decide how much truth he could handle. 3 years ago, I was part of a task force tracking international arms dealers. Kozlov was our white whale, smart, well-connected, and completely ruthless. We finally cornered his operation in Belarus. What happened? We burned it all down. Seized 200 million in assets, arrested 47 of his people, destroyed his entire European network. I paused, remembering the satisfaction I'd felt watching his empire crumble. I thought we'd gotten him too, but he slipped out in the chaos. And he blames you specifically? I was the one who broke his encryption, tracked his money flows, turned his lieutenants against him. Yeah, he blames me specifically. Morrison nodded grimly. So this is revenge. Partly. But if Command is right about him having government backing now, this is bigger than revenge. This is a statement. The plane began its descent, and I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that came before every mission. 4 years ago, I'd thought I was done with this feeling forever. I'd planned to spend the rest of my life fixing engines instead of lives, dealing with carburetors instead of conspiracies, but as we descended toward the drop zone in rural Moldova, I realized I'd been lying to myself. This was who I was. This was what I was built for. Millbrook had been a nice vacation from reality, but reality always wins in the end. 2 minutes. Morrison called out. I checked my gear one final time: primary weapon, backup pistol, combat knife, communications equipment, and a small device that looked like a garage door opener but could hack into almost any electronic system ever built. Some skills you never forget, no matter how hard you try. The jump itself was routine, a night halo drop from 30,000 feet that put us down in a forest clearing 12 miles from the target compound. We landed silently, efficiently, and immediately moved into tactical formation with Morrison on point and me bringing up the rear. The hike through the Moldovan countryside gave me time to think about what we might find at the compound. Best case scenario, Kozlov was using the captured operatives as bait, hoping to draw me in for a personal confrontation. Worst case, he'd already killed them and was planning something far more elaborate and destructive. Either way, 22 American lives hung in the balance. We reached the ridge overlooking the compound at 0347 local time, and what I saw through my night vision scope made my blood run cold. The facility looked exactly as it had in the satellite photos, but there were details the overhead imagery had missed. To bodies, at least a dozen of them, arranged in a deliberate pattern around the perimeter fence. Jesus, whispered Sergeant Martinez. Our sniper. Are those our people? I adjusted my scope's magnification and felt a mixture of relief and horror. No. Wrong uniforms. These are Kozlov's men. Morrison crouched beside me, studying the scene through his own optics. Why would he kill his own people? Because he's sending me a message, I realized. He wants me to know this isn't about money or territory anymore. This is personal, and he's willing to sacrifice anyone to make his point. We spent 20 minutes conducting reconnaissance, mapping patrol routes and identifying potential entry points. But something felt wrong about the whole setup. The compound was too lightly defended, too easy to approach. For someone as paranoid and careful as Viktor Kozlov, it was completely out of character. It's a trap, I told Morrison. Obviously. The question is whether we spring it or find another way in. Before I could answer, my communications headset crackled to life with a transmission on an emergency frequency I hadn't heard used in 4 years. Riley Chen. The voice was accented, cultured, and instantly recognizable despite the years that had passed. I know you're out there, my dear. Why don't you come inside? We have so much to discuss. Viktor Kozlov. Speaking directly to me over military communications channels, which meant he had access to equipment and encryption codes that should have been impossible to obtain. All teams, radio silence, Morrison ordered immediately, but the damage was done. Kozlov knew we were here, knew our communications frequencies, and was clearly in control of the situation in ways that made our carefully planned mission look like amateur hour. I made a decision that probably violated every protocol in the Special Operations Handbook. Morrison, take your team back to the extraction point. This isn't your fight anymore. Like hell. We don't leave people behind. You're not leaving anyone behind. You're preventing more casualties. I was already moving, checking my weapons and preparing to do something incredibly stupid. Kozlov wants me? Fine. But he gets me on my terms, not his. What I did next was either brilliant tactical thinking or the dumbest thing I'd ever attempted in my military career. Instead of approaching the compound directly, I circled around to the north side where a small creek provided natural cover. If Kozlov was expecting me to walk through his front door, I'd disappoint him by coming through the window. The facility's perimeter defenses were more sophisticated than they'd appeared from a distance. Motion sensors, infrared cameras, pressure plates buried in the ground, the kind of security setup that cost serious money and suggested serious backing. But I'd trained for this kind of infiltration, and muscle memory guided me through a route that avoided the worst of the surveillance grid. It took me 47 minutes to reach the main building, during which time I spotted at least 12 guards who had no idea I was there. Either Kozlov's security had gotten sloppy in the years since our last encounter, or he was deliberately letting me through. I was betting on the latter. The building's rear entrance was secured with an electronic lock that my little garage door opener device cracked in under 30 seconds. As the door clicked open, I half expected alarms to start blaring, floodlights to snap on, and guards to come running from every direction. Instead, I found silence. The interior of the facility was exactly what you'd expect from a CIA listening post: rows of computer equipment, banks of monitors displaying intelligence feeds, and workstations where analysts had been tracking threats to American interests. But everything was dark, powered down, abandoned, and in the center of the main operations room, tied to chairs with professional efficiency, were 22 Americans in various states of consciousness. They were alive. Beaten, exhausted, probably traumatized, but alive. Well, came a voice from the shadows. The famous Riley Chen. You look different without the uniform. Viktor Kozlov stepped into the dim light, and I was struck by how much he'd aged in 4 years. His dark hair had gone mostly gray, deep lines creased his face, and he moved with the careful precision of someone dealing with chronic pain. But his eyes were the same, intelligent, ruthless, and completely without mercy. "Victor." I kept my weapon lowered but ready. "You're looking older. Prison will do that to a man. Did you know I spent 18 months in a Belarusian cell because of you? 18 months of concrete walls, terrible food, and guards who took pleasure in reminding me daily that my empire was gone. My heart bleeds." He smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I'm sure it does. You always were sentimental about the consequences of your actions." Behind him, I could see 3 guards positioned strategically around the room. Professional placement, interlocking fields of fire, no clear shot at Kozlov without exposing myself to return fire. He'd planned this conversation carefully. "Here's what's going to happen," he continued. "You're going to drop your weapons, submit to restraint, and accompany me to a more private location where we can discuss the terms of these people's release. And if I refuse?" He gestured casually, and one of his guards pressed a pistol to the head of a young CIA analyst who couldn't have been more than 25 years old. "Then we start reducing the number of hostages until you become more cooperative." I looked at the faces of the captured Americans, intelligence officers, communication specialists, analysts who dedicated their lives to protecting national security. They'd been caught in a trap meant for me, used as bait to draw me into Kozlov's web of revenge, but as I studied their faces, I noticed something Kozlov had apparently missed. The CIA analyst with the gun to her head was making subtle hand signals. Operational codes I recognized from my own training. She was telling me that the hostages weren't as helpless as they appeared, that they'd been working on their restraints, that they were ready to act if given the chance. These weren't just victims. They were trained operatives who'd been waiting for an opportunity. "You know what your problem always was, Victor?" I said, slowly reaching for my sidearm. "You underestimate people. Drop the weapon, Chen." "No, I don't think I will." I smiled, feeling the familiar calm that came over me in moments of extreme danger. "See, you spent so much time planning this elaborate revenge fantasy that you forgot something important." "And what's that?" "I never lose." What happened next occurred in the space of approximately 4 seconds, but felt like it stretched across hours. The CIA analyst jerked her head sideways just as I put 2 rounds center mass into the guard threatening her. The other hostages, who'd apparently been cutting their restraints for hours, surged into action with the coordinated precision of people who'd trained for exactly this scenario. Kozlov's remaining guards tried to respond, but they were caught between multiple threats and couldn't decide whether to shoot at me or the suddenly mobile hostages. It was exactly the kind of tactical confusion that gets people killed in close-quarters combat. I put down the second guard with a headshot that would have made my marksmanship instructor proud, then pivoted to engage the third. But he was already down, taken out by Captain Williams of the 75th Ranger Regiment, who'd apparently been working on his zip-tie restraints since the moment he'd been captured, which left Viktor Kozlov standing alone in the middle of his carefully planned revenge scenario, watching it fall apart around him with the same expression he'd worn 4 years ago when I destroyed his empire in Belarus. "You always were too clever for your own good," I told him, keeping my weapon trained on his center mass. "This isn't over, Chen. You have no idea who you're really fighting." "Then enlighten me." Instead of answering, he reached inside his jacket. I had a split second to decide whether he was going for a weapon or something else entirely. Given his history and the circumstances, I made the only choice that made tactical sense. The shot echoed through the abandoned facility like thunder. Viktor Kozlov dropped to the ground, a small device falling from his hand. It looked like a modified cell phone, probably a dead man's switch for explosives or some kind of communication system. We'd never know for sure. "Facilities clear," I announced into my communications headset. 22 hostages recovered, all alive. Request immediate extraction. Morrison's voice crackled back through the static. "Copy that, Chen. Choppers inbound, ETA 15 minutes. As the rescued operatives began checking each other for injuries and securing the facility, Captain Williams approached me with a grim expression. "Chen, you need to see this." He led me to one of the computer workstations where he'd apparently been working during his captivity. The screen showed a series of financial transfers, communication logs, and operational plans that made my blood run cold. Viktor Kozlov hadn't been working alone. He'd been funded and equipped by a consortium of private military contractors, arms dealers, and government officials from at least 6 different countries. The Moldova operation wasn't just revenge, it was a field test for a much larger plan involving compromised intelligence assets across Eastern Europe. How many facilities like this are there? I asked. According to these files? At least a dozen, maybe more. And they're all targets. The implications were staggering. If Kozlov's backers could successfully capture or compromise a dozen CIA listening posts, they could blind American intelligence operations across an entire region. The Moldova facility had been just the beginning. We need to get this intelligence back to command immediately, Williams said. I nodded, but I was already thinking beyond the immediate tactical situation. Viktor Kozlov was dead, but his network was still out there. The people who'd funded his revenge operation were still planning their larger assault on American intelligence capabilities. My quiet life in Millbrook, Tennessee, was officially over. The extraction helicopters arrived exactly on schedule, their rotor wash scattering papers and debris throughout the abandoned facility. As I helped load the rescued operatives, I caught sight of my reflection in one of the aircraft's windows. The woman looking back at me wasn't Riley Chen, small-town mechanic. She was the special operations soldier I'd been trained to be, the weapon my country had forged through years of the most demanding military training in the world. I'd tried to walk away from this life once before. But as we lifted off into the Moldovan dawn, I realized that some responsibilities don't end just because you want them to. Some fights follow you no matter how far you run. Colonel Martinez was waiting when we landed at the airbase in Romania. She looked exactly as composed as she had in my garage, as if orchestrating international rescue operations was just another item on her daily to-do list. Outstanding work, Chen, she said as I climbed down from the helicopter. The intelligence you recovered is already proving invaluable. Good. Now I want to go home. About that. She gestured toward a black SUV idling nearby. We need to discuss your future. I'd known this conversation was coming, but I'd hoped to put it off until I could think clearly. The mission adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me exhausted and emotionally drained. There is no future, Colonel. I did what you asked. Kozlov's dead, the hostages are safe, and you have his intelligence files. I fulfilled my end of the bargain. The bargain's changed. The intelligence you recovered shows this network is planning operations against American assets worldwide. We need someone with your specific skills and knowledge to help shut them down. Find someone else. There is no one else, Chen. You're the only operator who's faced this network before, the only one who understands how they think and operate. We reached the SUV, and I stopped walking. Through the tinted windows, I could see other passengers, analysts, probably, or command staff who wanted to debrief me immediately. What about my life in Millbrook? My garage, my customers, the community I've built there. All of that will still be there when this is over. And when will this be over? Next month? Next year? Never. Colonel Martinez studied me with the same appraising look she'd used 4 years ago when she'd signed my discharge papers. I don't know, Chen. But I know that if we don't stop this network now, a lot of good people are going to die. And I know that you're the best chance we have of preventing that. She was right, of course. She was always right about these things, which was what made her both an excellent commanding officer and a dangerous person to cross. I thought about Mrs. Henderson and her ancient Buick, about Tommy Patterson and his Honda with the blown timing belt, about the quiet streets of Millbrook where the biggest excitement was usually the annual corn festival. That life had been real, meaningful, and more peaceful than anything I'd experienced in my military career, but it had also been borrowed time. A vacation from the responsibility that came with having the skills to make a difference in situations like this. How long do I have to think about it? I asked. The plane to Washington leaves in 2 hours. After that, the trail starts to go cold. 2 hours to decide between the life I wanted and the life I was built for. 2 hours to choose between personal happiness and professional obligation. In the end, it wasn't really a choice at all. I'll need to make some phone calls, I said, opening the SUV door. Let people know I'll be gone longer than expected. Colonel Martinez smiled, the first genuine expression of emotion I'd seen from her since she'd appeared at my garage. "Welcome back, Chen." As the SUV pulled away from the airbase, I watched the Romanian countryside roll past and thought about the conversation I'd need to have with whoever the army had sent to run my garage. Mrs. Henderson would understand about the delay with her Buick. Tommy Patterson would probably turn the story of military helicopters into local legend, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, eventually, I'd find my way back to that quiet life. Maybe after we'd shut down Kozlov's network, after we'd secured American intelligence assets, after we'd made the world a little bit safer, maybe, but for now, I had work to do. The kind of work that required all the skills I'd tried so hard to forget, all the training I'd hoped never to use again. Viktor Kozlov was dead, but his legacy lived on in the network he'd helped build. 22 Americans had been saved, but dozens more were still at risk, and somewhere in a small town in Tennessee, an ancient Buick sat in a garage, waiting for its mechanic to come home. I just hoped I'd still remember how to be Riley Chen when this was all over. The plane to Washington was already warming up its engines when we reached the airfield. Through the windows, I could see analysts and operations specialists preparing for what would probably be the most important briefing of my career, but as I climbed the stairs to board the aircraft, I made myself a promise: no matter how long this mission took, no matter where it led me, I would find my way back to Millbrook. Back to a life where the biggest emergency was a blown transmission and the most dangerous weapon was a torque wrench. Some secrets are worth keeping. Some lives are worth living, and some promises are worth keeping, even when the world insists on pulling you in a different direction. The mechanic's secret was out, but the mechanic herself wasn't gone forever, just temporarily reassigned. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.